welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tylik, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. Today we're talking about community corrections, or the myriad of policies and technologies that are turning our communities into cages. Before we get into tonight's program, let's learn 5 quick facts about community corrections to ground us.
What if a judge put a price tag on your freedom and you couldn't afford it? My name is Bianca Tylik. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and here are 5 facts you should know about community corrections in the prison industry. The U.S. is one of only 2 countries that allows commercial bail bonds. Every year, people post $16 billion in bail, and still an estimated 500,000 people are held in local jails because they can't afford their bail. People on bail, as well as those on probation or parole, can be put on electronic monitoring and required to pay supervision fees as high as $40 a day. Between 1980 and 2018, the number of people under community supervision more than tripled from 1.3 to 4.4 million, bringing the number of people under correctional control to 1 in 40 adults. Technical violations of probation and parole now account for a quarter of all prison admissions. Learn more with the curriculum at worthrises.org.
A little later in the show, we'll be talking to James Kilgore and Victoria Law. But first, I'd like to introduce Vinny Schiraldi. Vinny is the senior research scientist at the Columbia School of Social Work and co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab. He has extensive experience in public life, founding the policy think tank, the Justice Policy Institute, and then moving to government as director of juvenile corrections in Washington, D.C., commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation, and senior policy advisor to the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Vinny, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Bianca.
So let's start by helping folks understand what it means to be under correctional control and supervision in the community. If you're under what we are calling community corrections, you must be either under probation or parole. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Sure. Both of them were invented in the 1800s. Probation was originated as an alternative to incarceration. So it's a sentence a judge could give you right at court. And parole comes at the end of your sentence. It was generally originally meant to take a look at people while they were doing their prison time, see if they were participating in programs and behaving while they were locked up. And if they were, they could get released earlier, but they'd be supervised in the community by a parole officer. In both cases, they were both originally meant to be very helpful. Although you were conditionally released, the thought was that only rarely would you mess up enough in the community to get locked back up. Really, it was meant to be a very friendly, they literally, and I'm not using that word friendly frivolously, it was based on a friendly visiting program where white upper class people would visit the homes of mostly European immigrants to sort of acculturate them. So there's always a bit of paternalism, actually mainly maternalism, involved, because it was mostly women that were doing that visiting. And that probation and parole sort of adopted that parents patriot, a state as guardian approach to people.
So today there are roughly 4.4 million people on either probation or parole, bringing the total carceral population, including those in prisons and jails that we've been talking about most of this curriculum, to 6.5 million people. So you're starting to tell us a little bit about, the precursors of probation and parole, but can you tell us briefly, like, how we got to these numbers?
Right, so it begins as this ostensibly helpful program. And then in the 1970s, a couple things happened. One is Richard Nixon and the Republican Party decide to racialize poverty and crime issues with the Southern strategy, a strategy meant to sort of covertly associate crime policy and poverty policy with race, sort of early dog whistle stuff. So that we weren't going to talk about Black people being bad, we were going to talk about poor people being bad and enact policies that target them. And the other thing that happened was the notion that the system really wasn't rehabilitating people. It was really a system of social control and punishment. And so there was a paper that came out in New York City by Robert Martinson called the Martinson Report. And it claimed that rehabilitative programs don't work. Nothing really works when it comes to turning people's lives around. So those things hit at the same time. Prison population started to explode, mandatory sentences started getting passed, but less well known is what happened to probation and parole, which is that this thing that was at least ostensibly trying to be helpful and rehabilitative turned into a much more surveillance-focused trail them, nail them, and jail them process. The number of conditions people had mushroomed, and people who were supervising them, both the line probation and parole officers and their supervisors, all the way up the line, developed a hair trigger response to frivolous technical violations. Think missing appointments, getting high, moving without telling your PO, getting a driver's license, getting a credit card without asking permission, marrying somebody with a felony record. All these things are against the rules for people under supervision and can and do result in their incarceration. So this thing now that was designed to be an alternative mushrooms right alongside corrections and prisons. You would think that if it was really an alternative and we were doing it a whole bunch more, then there'd be fewer people locked up, not more. But as prisons grew, probation and parole grew. So really they weren't an alternative to incarceration, they were an alternative to freedom.
Vinny, wow, I like even hearing you say, right, specifically that getting a credit card could be a particular violation is so wild, and I think probably in itself could use explaining. But let's go down that path a little bit. Can you help the audience understand like how probation and parole can impact a person's life? Perhaps, help us by walking us through a typical example of how things might spiral in each case. How does somebody get on probation? How does that, what are the, conditions? How do they get there in the first place? And how can that end in those cases? And similarly for parole.
Yeah, so the overwhelming amount of time people get on probation, it's as a result of a plea bargain. And so, their attorneys are doing the best they can. The freight keeps rising for crimes, right? So things that used to get you probation or nothing before are now getting you incarceration. And so your attorneys are scrambling to keep you out of prison. And in their view, and in yours, in many cases, you're thinking probation's a better deal. So let's talk about Meek Mill, because people, tend to have heard of Meek Mill a lot, right? The hip hop artist from Philadelphia commits a gun crime when he's 19 years old, or at least allegedly commits it. I think there's some doubt about whether he did or not, and gets 9 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation. And in Philadelphia at the time, that was actually a pretty good deal. So I think 19-year-old Meek Mill probably felt like he did pretty well there. He didn't think 11 years later he would still be on probation because He would mess up a little here, mess up a little there, no new crimes, by the way, which is what we all care about. But he wasn't complying to the judge's satisfaction, and she extended and extended and extended his probation over and over and over again for crazy stuff, Bianca. Like, she ordered him to go to a soup kitchen to ladle soup. She goes to the soup kitchen to check on him, even though there's a whole probation department assigned to do that. She goes and checks on him, and instead of ladling soup at that time, he's there, but he's folding clothes. She calls him in for a hearing on a possible probation violation. So this goes on for 11 years. Now he's 30. He spent his whole sort of young adulthood under the supervision of the court. And finally, he gets violated and in prison for 2 to 4 years, more time than he got for his original crime, for getting in a fight with a paparazzi in an airport, which was dismissed, and for popping a wheelie on a motorcycle in New York City when he was filming a video, which was also dismissed. That gets him sent to prison. Yeah, I'm not going to say that's typical, because he, by that point, was actually pretty famous. But that's the kind of stuff, those little ticky-tack fouls that can run you afoul of a judge who starts to lose the kind of context that really what society cares about is you not breaking the law again, not you following every jot and tittle of a court order.
Yeah, so Vinny, if you can, let's Meek Mill's situation aside only because he is famous, and maybe talking about sort of the average person, right? Like, people can end up on probation because they can't afford a fine, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Right, so like they there's an option to either pay a fine or serve time on probation, and they then might have conditions of confinement, right? Or not confinement, excuse me, but conditions of their supervision, right? So those could be drug programs that they have to pay for, or electronic monitoring that they have to pay for. Inability to pay could do what?
Could land them back in jail. And it's often kind of like a whole hodgepodge of standard conditions. So one that's typical is association. You're not allowed to associate with somebody with a criminal record. So let's say me and you used to rob liquor stores together. I think it's reasonable for the court to say, you can't hang out with Bianca anymore. I think it's unreasonable for the court to say, you can't ever hang out with anybody named Bianca ever again. And that's what the standard conditions are like. Anybody with a criminal record, you can't hang out with. So drug use is a typical condition. And this gets to your question, that it's just a standard condition, whether I ever had a drug problem or not. I might just be a lousy driver and I run a lot of red lights. I might just not pay enough attention, whatever. But if I get on private probation because I haven't paid my tickets, and the private probation company decides to institute a drug testing regimen for me and make it a condition, now suddenly I have to pay for that test. Let's imagine I actually smoked a joint somewhere within 30 days of getting that test. Now they might require me to go to treatment. And for every additional bit of stuff they require, they charge. They run the treatment program. They put you on electronic monitoring. They run that program too.
And what's interesting though too is like, so, we're talking a lot about probation, but technically on parole, it's pretty similar, right? Like, I think about New York State. There's a requirement when you are paroled in New York State that you have to go to anger management courses, right, regardless of whether your crime has anything to do with anger management. And you have to pay for that. You can't get your license for 6 months for no apparent reason, regardless of whether your crime has anything to do with vehicles. You just simply can't get your driver's license. So, these implications of probation and parole are quite extensive. So let's talk about that. Like, the impact is not just felt though at this individual level. Today, there are 25% of prison admissions are for technical probation and parole violations. In fact, over the past year, we've listened to several awful stories of people dying from COVID in prison or jail because they're there on a technical violation. Can you, for the audience, really precisely explain what is a technical violation as different from a new crime? And what's the impact here on broader society?
So technical violations are things like missing appointments, anything that's not a crime, but that's a rule of probation or parole. If you fail to do it, you can be incarcerated for a technical violation. So as I said earlier, getting a credit card, they can literally say, you can't get a credit card without my permission as a PO. So it's a technical violation if you do. Traveling out of state without permission. I met a guy when I was commissioner who, I spoke at some event in Brownsville. He came up to me afterwards. He was a pretty nice guy. He was incredibly calm considering how we had screwed this guy. And he had gotten a scholarship to a college in Jersey, exactly what we want people on probation to do, right? And he asked his PO, can you give me permission to travel to Jersey so I can accept the scholarship? And his PO was inclined to do it, but he asked his supervisor was inclined to do it, but it had to travel up this sort of heartless chain of command. And by the time it got up and down to get him permission, which he ultimately was granted permission, it was too late. He had to turn the scholarship down. He was not, he managed, he went to college in New York City. But the rules in these bureaucracies tend to travel in one direction. I don't care about you criminals. I care about me. And so if there's a chance, any kind of chance that by letting you out of state or letting you get a credit card or letting you move without permission or letting you stay out after 7 p.m. at night, literally these are all conditions, or letting you associate with somebody else with a criminal record, if there's an infinitesimally small chance you might do something bad and it might come back on me, I'm not gonna take that chance. I'm gonna screw you. And that's not even individual POs. It's just kind of systemically so that anything that might have made sense at one point for one person on probation, I am going to make a rule for all persons on probation because I don't want that risk to touch me. That's what happens when you grossly trivialize people's liberty interests.
Right, and it's the one size fits all. And I think, the example you gave about people leaving state actually ties into our guest last week. We had Joseph on last week who was extradited from New York back to Florida where he had served time simply because he had left the state early, not because there was a new crime, not because anything happened, but because a condition of his parole or release was staying in state for a year. And he had nobody in the state really, right? And he didn't have a support network there. And so he went back to New York where he did, and he was picked up and returned to Florida just to be released upon essentially return. Yeah. So just to close this out here, Vinny, a lot of people will say, does monitoring, or ask rather, does monitoring make us safer? In your perspective, does it make us safer? And if not, what is the solution? How do we find our way out of this seemingly expanding carceral machine?
Yeah, I don't think there's evidence that probation and parole make us safer. Amy Solomon, who's now at Arnold Ventures, but was at the Urban Institute, did a pretty sophisticated analysis of people on parole, people leaving prison under supervision and people who leave prison and aren't under supervision, and found no difference in recidivism. Virginia actually abolished parole for 4 years. And during that 4-year time period, crime in Virginia dropped by 30%. Then they reinstated it for political reasons, but not because there was evidence that was improving. Some of the better evidence-based practices researchers on probation show that it is not does not reduce crime writ large. That doesn't mean for any individual it might not. You might get a good PO, they might help you find a job, and it might work. But writ large, probation doesn't reduce recidivism and isn't associated with reductions in incarceration, but it's also supposed to be an alternative to incarceration. It's actually correlated with a slight increase in incarceration. So
that seems in line with the fact that 25% of the carceral population is coming from technical probation violations. So really quick, Vinny, what do we do?
Yeah. So I think this is a time of reckoning and a time of watershed exploration. I think we should at least consider abolition and consider saying, all right, what are we really hoping to get out of this? We're hoping to get better and safer communities. How about we capture some of that $2.6 billion a year we're spending on these people to technically violate people and stick them back in prison, and work with communities to design things that help keep them safer and help bring their loved ones home from incarceration in ways that will succeed. And I'm betting that the communities will come up with much better solutions than we correctional bureaucrats ever could. And if we can't get all the way to abolition, I think we should consider substantially reducing it. California took 150,000 people off probation and parole, and it is slightly safer than it was before. New York City used to have 82,000 people on probation. We have 13,000 people on probation now, and crime has plunged in New York City. So I think we can do this. Whether we can go all the way to abolition or not, I don't know, but let's start.
Vinny, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you at the end of the show. To learn more about Vinny's work, you can follow him on Twitter at Vinny Schiraldi or at CU Justice Lab. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is James Kilgore. James is a formerly incarcerated activist and researcher and the director of the Challenging E-Carceration Project at MediaJustice. He is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning Understanding Mass Incarceration. He also has a new book entitled Understanding E-Carceration, forthcoming with the New Press. In his home community of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, he is the co-director of the First Followers Reentry Program, an organization of people who have experienced incarceration who now work to provide support to those returning home from prison. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Bianca. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, James, Vinny helped us understand a bit about the world of probation and parole and how conditions are often imposed on people under that sort of correctional control. One of the most popular conditions, and increasingly so, is electronic monitoring, what some may recognize as ankle monitors, but we know is now much more. James, you are one of the nation's leading experts on electronic monitoring. Every single time somebody asks me anything about it, I say, please call James. Can you start by helping us understand the real impact that an electronic monitor can have on someone's life?
Okay, thanks, Bianca. Well, I'd like to start by saying my knowledge of electronic monitoring does come from having spent a year on an electronic monitor myself as a condition of my parole. So that was back in 2009 when I came home from prison. My parole agent visited me the next day and said, "You're going to be on this monitor and you're now going to be allowed out of the house from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday." And all of a sudden I realized freedom had a very different meaning when I was on an electronic monitor. So since that time, I've really spent quite a bit of time thinking about where's this technology going, who's making up the rules, and of course, who's making money from this. And I've talked to dozens and dozens of people who have been on electronic monitors or who have had loved ones on electronic monitors. And really, the stories they tell are all pretty similar. I think the biggest thing that people complain about is the fact that usually electronic monitoring comes with house arrest. To leave the house for any purpose, you have to get permission from a probation officer, a parole officer, or whoever your supervisor is. And sometimes you have to get permission 5 days, 10 days in advance before you can even leave. So this is a huge restriction on people trying to get work, trying to spend time with their family, trying to do caregiving, particularly with people who may not be living in the residence where they're living. If there's family emergencies, you have to think about, do I respond to this emergency without permission from the parole agent and run the risk of being sent back to prison, or do I wait it out and hope for the best at the other end? So there's a whole set of ways in which your life becomes very much constrained by the electronic monitor. It's an extreme version of parole and probation. But there are a couple of other things which are important to recognize also, that when people are on electronic monitor, particularly in a pre-trial setting, the conditions of electronic monitoring can be so restrictive that they actually coerce people into accepting plea deals, which is part of the reason why we push to get rid of cash bail, why we push to get rid of pretrial detention, because being in jail means you're more likely to accept a deal that's not acceptable. But electronic monitors have the same kind of impact on people. And then a third thing I want to just take note of is that some people have to pay to be on a monitor. You can pay anywhere from $5 to $40 a day to be on a monitor. We know that people who are on monitors are what I call the criminalized sector of the working class, people who have precarious employment, low incomes, and adding $5, $10, $20 a day onto their already overstretched budgets or the budgets of their family is really too much. So at the end of the day, a lot of people speak to me and say, being on an electronic monitor, not only did it impact me, but it turned my house into a prison, and it made my family into my prison guards, and that was a crushing blow to me and my family. I didn't want to bring that into my household.
Thank you, James. And I want to just like lift that up, right? You said $20, $30 a day. Like that is a massive cost. I mean, that is a massive cost for
Actually, I've heard of people paying 40, so I'm just...
Right. So like $40 a day to be on an electronic monitor that is, as you said, restricting your movement. I mean, I think we also have to remember that, these monitors have to be charged. So this is attached to your body in many cases, and, means you're attached literally to a wall for 2 hours a day in order to, charge the monitor, as you say, not able to like respond to emergencies. I mean, we told the story of Sarah in the report that we wrote, and, Sarah who gave birth while she was on an electronic monitor, and the idea of not being able to care for your infant, right, to actually respond to emergencies because you're on an electronic monitor is really devastating. And so I want to hone in on this like last piece though that you said about what it means to have your home become a prison and your family become correctional officers. Many like call electronic monitoring a alternative to incarceration, but in reality, it's more like an alternative form of incarceration. So can you explain a little bit more about why electronic monitoring, or what you've described as e-carceration, is not in fact better than incarceration?
Okay. Well, I think to make one point clear, I don't call electronic monitoring e-carceration. I mean, for me, e-carceration is a whole set of technologies that deprive people of their liberty. So the definition of e-carceration for me is the use of technology to deprive people of their liberty. And the electronic monitor is one of the prime examples of that. But I would consider, for example, even facial recognition technology, license plate readers, a whole range of surveillance devices as really technologies that deprive people of their liberty. So, but an electronic monitor is a specific form of e-carceration, and it does recreate the environment of a prison in people's homes. And so we do call it an alternative form of incarceration because it restricts your movement, it limits your ability to work, to earn income. It limits your ability to seek medical care. It limits your ability to participate in family activities or caregiving activities. So it creates a whole range of limitations on your ability to actually live your life. And when people come out of prison, for example, and are put on a monitor, they're expecting that they're now free, that they're now in a position to be able to live their life, to be able to try to find employment, to make a contribution to their family and their community. And instead, they have to worry about all these restrictions. So for example, when you're on an electronic monitor, you usually have a curfew or a limitation, a time limit for your movement. So if you go out with your family and the time of your movement is getting for your movement to end is getting near, all of a sudden the whole family's getting agitated and they're trying to hurry you up. Finish your food. We got to get home. We got to get home. So it puts all these worries onto the family, who then have to look after you. Then there's a whole question of the technology itself doesn't work that well. As you've pointed out, a lot of people, you have to plug it in. What if you're an unhoused person? Where do you plug in your ankle shackle? I prefer to call them shackles rather than bracelets because they're not jewelry. But where do you plug it in? So we see people going to McDonald's not for fries, but for the electricity to plug in their electronic monitor. How humiliating is that? And then you have the way some of these devices are working now. They're actually carrying on conversations with you. So you go into a public space and all of a sudden your ankle monitor is talking to you and everybody's looking at you. So, I mean, all of these things are huge shaming, huge ways of further humiliating you. Now if you finish your time in prison, you're now revisiting all the fears that you had when you were in prison. If you're on a pretrial electronic monitor, you're supposed to be innocent till proven guilty, but yet you're finding all these conditions of incarceration being imposed on your daily life. So there's really no way we can call this an alternative to incarceration. It's just a way of extending the punitive mentality that's dominated the era of mass incarceration and continues to find new forms to express itself.
Yeah, I think that piece, I'm sure, is really shocking people. The fact that these ankle shackles now can actually talk to you. And I would say they can't just talk to you, they can also listen to you, which means that, without subpoenas, we essentially have live recording devices walking around on people's ankles. And so not only are they being monitored, but anybody around them is being monitored. So with that, James, can you help us understand the scale of e-carceration at this point, and maybe even more specifically, electronic monitoring, as you noted the difference? We're seeing, where are we seeing the most growth? Who is pushing it? We know that this is an area highly dominated by private corporations. So who are they? So
the two main areas of growth for electronic monitoring specifically would be immigration and pretrial, because we've seen, and particularly during COVID, we've seen a lot of pressure to release people from jails and prisons, but most of the pressure went to jails, and so a lot of jurisdictions took people out and put them on electronic monitors. Some jurisdictions had so many people on electronic monitors, like Chicago, Allegheny County in Pennsylvania, they ran out of devices. The sheriff of Chicago went and got another $13 million from the county authorities to buy more electronic monitors because there was such a demand for him to put people on monitors rather than to just take them out into the pandemic time and give them a little bit of freedom to move around. So the whole push for decarceration, ending cash bail, has resulted in the expansion of electronic monitoring. Secondly, we've seen that more and more people under the authority of ICE are being put on electronic monitors. And once again, they're being put on devices that more and more are able to capture data, not just location, but are able to capture other kinds of biometric data. And as you point out, some of these devices can capture videos. Some of them are apps that apply to your phone. And so you're actually letting the Department of Corrections into your phone. So for example, in Illinois, where I live, they went around to people who were on parole during the pandemic, and they asked them all to download the SmartLink app, which is produced by BI, that would enable their parole agents to monitor them virtually without having to visit. So this is just one of the technological innovations of BI, which is the biggest electronic monitoring company in the U.S., which is a subsidiary of the biggest private prison operator in the world, the Geo Group. So there's a few big players. Securus is another one. They have a company called satellite tracking of people, which is called STOP. And then we have 2 Israeli companies, the Supercom and Attenti, which are also big players in electronic monitoring, and then dozens and dozens of ma and pa electronic monitoring operators.
Right. So, and I'm going to try to get through these last few questions quickly. But James, so I mean, I think I really hope people caught on to what you said there right at the end, which is, BI, which is now the largest electronic monitoring corporation, is a subsidiary of the largest private prison corporation, right? So what we're seeing is this shifting of these private corporations, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But many of these corporations that have traditionally marketed ankle monitors are shifting to new technologies. And I think you've started to help us understand those technologies as, some of the devices on people's phones and others. But can you say just a quick word about how that technology is shifting surveillance in the community?
Well, I think, basically if everybody's cell phone is a surveillance device, which it is because we have GPS tracking, and most people don't switch it off on their phone. And even if they do, there's other ways they can be tracked. But so everyone is now having a surveillance device on their person. So it really, and then we have people within that subset of a community. And let's face it, the population is a targeted population. It's disproportionately Black and brown people. And these communities are now becoming deeply surveilled through all this technology. And the other thing about it is that these companies, like Jay-Z, for example, has something called the Promise app, but there's other apps that are being marketed as sort of user-friendly, not intrusive, not a surveillance device, not an ugly ankle shackle, but just slick and neat, put it on your phone. But these things are actually more dangerous than an ankle monitor because they can gather a whole lot more data, and that data ends up going to the cloud. And who runs the cloud but the big technology companies, AWM, Microsoft, Google, and so forth. So there's a whole lot of ways in which this net of e-carceration is becoming broader and broader and connecting more and more people through the, as we want to call them, the great databases in the sky, the great data clouds in the sky.
Yeah, and we know that, cloud data and data just generally is obviously like the currency of our time, right? That in many ways, like that product, the commodification of data, where we go, how we move, what we do is so valuable to the corporate world. So just here in the last minute, James, sort of the same question I asked Vinny, is there any proof that electronic monitoring is working given all the harm that it's creating? Is it creating safety in any way? Are we getting anything meaningful out of it? And if not, what do we have to do to reverse the trend?
Well, not only is there nothing to prove that it's doing any good, but there's basically almost no research on electronic monitoring. There's no national database, so we don't even know how many people are on monitors. We estimate it's about 350,000, but we don't really know. And most local and state authorities don't gather much data on electronic monitoring, if any at all. They don't do racial breakdowns. They don't tell us how many people are sent back to prison or jail for violating the rules of their electronic monitoring. So we know very little, and they've been given a free pass. They don't have to do evaluation. They don't have to do reports. They don't have to do assessments. They just have to make an application for funding, and it gets refunded, and it keeps kicking in each year on a grander scale. So this is a myth. Electronic monitoring is a myth, just like the myth of mass incarceration. If we do this, it's going to do the following, but we don't have to account for it because we know best. So that's where we sit with electronic monitoring. So what we've done as Challenging E-Carceration, what we've done in the absence of accessible data, we've gathered the data of lived experience of people and done our own field research and put this into what we call a hotspots of electronic monitoring map, which provides an opportunity for people to learn more about electronic monitoring through the lived experience of people, which for us is the most important database. And if we're going to change this, we need to hear the stories and the experience of directly impacted people, talking to legislators, talking to decision makers who in the end have the final power in terms of getting rid of this.
Thank you, James, so much for your work and for being here. We'll see you at the end of the show.
Thank you, Bianca. Appreciate it.
To keep up with James' work, please visit challengingecarceration.org. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag punishmentprofit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Next, I want to bring in Victoria Law. Victoria is a freelance journalist covering issues of incarceration. She's the author of Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms, and Prisons Make Us Safer, and 20 other myths about mass incarceration. Welcome, Victoria.
Thanks for having me.
So, Vicki, for many years now, criminal justice advocates have been demanding change. And in recent years, criminal justice has become what they call a bipartisan issue. There are now people on all sides acknowledging mass incarceration in different ways and calling for its end for various reasons. But all solutions are not created equal, or in this case, not all solutions lead to liberation. Can you help us understand how many of the quote unquote reforms we see today are actually more harmful than helpful in creating cages out of our communities?
Yes. What we see in this bipartisan push to end mass incarceration as we know it is a push not to end the punishment paradigm that prisons and jails and all sorts of confinement are based on, but to simply take people out of the physical jails and prisons while creating new types of institutions in our homes, as James and Vinny just described, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And it doesn't actually end any of the root causes of why people go to jails and prisons. I like Vinny's description of these reforms not as alternatives to incarceration, but as alternatives to freedom. And at the same time, what we see is that we also see that these new types of reforms like electronic monitoring, like probation, like drug treatment, turn into net widening opportunities. So people who would not necessarily go to jail or go to prison for very minor actions are now given this opportunity to avoid incarceration by being placed under a type of punitive monitoring and supervision that increases their chances of sliding into jail and prison, of making their lives harder, of basically making them unable to survive and thrive. James mentioned Chicago during the COVID pandemic at the very beginning, when the Cook County Jail became an early hotspot of the coronavirus. And there was a move to get people out, not just by releasing them, but by putting them on electronic monitors. And what ended up happening, as James described, was that Chicago had a gigantic population under electronic monitoring when they were still supposedly awaiting their day in court and awaiting whether or not they were found guilty or innocent. And then you fast forward to a few months later, and Chicago now has the largest pretrial electronic monitoring population, and jail numbers have begun to rise again. So now you have the option of keeping people in your physical jail, in crowded cells and dormitories where coronavirus can spread, or placing them on electronic monitoring. So you can essentially increase the number of people under some sort of state supervision. Again, always with the threat of, if you don't comply, we will send you back to prison. So what we see again and again are many of these reforms mimic and replicate prisons, just without the physical bars and wires that we see.
Yeah, one of the things it makes me think of, right, is that when we often say, like, if you build it, they will fill it, right? If you build the prisons, they will fill those prisons. And with electronic monitoring, it feels similar, right? It's like, if you give them the electronic monitors, they will put people on them. And so long as now Chicago has these, thousands of additional devices, they're going to keep utilizing them because why not, right? So if the harm is so obvious to us, and it certainly, appears to be, why are people buying into these reforms as solutions to mass incarcerations? I know that the corporations have contributed largely to these narratives by in large part co-opting the language of criminal justice advocates. So can you explain how they're doing that?
Well, the system is very good at co-opting demands. I mean, we see that when there were concerns about overcrowded women's prisons, the system built more female, gender responsive prisons. In California, it was run by a GEO group. So they responded by saying, oh, we can incarcerate women better than the state can. What we see also is that as demands for decarceration, for prison reform, for an end to many of the egregious abuses that are happening inside prison are growing and gaining more attention, there's a co-optation of the language to say, we can provide this service humanely. It may not look like the physical jail or prison that you're used to seeing, but it also plays on people's ideas and fears about safety. Everybody wants to be safe. I think very few people want to live in Mad Max world where they have to constantly be on guard against attacks whenever they leave their house or in their houses. So these corporations play on that fear by saying, we can get rid of these conditions that are concerning or egregious or unjust or outrageous, but we can also keep you safe from all the people. And Vinny talked about these racialized fears that, gets dog whistled, where we can keep people safe. We can keep you safe from these people that you fear by putting them on electronic monitoring, by putting them in lockdown psychiatric hospitals, by putting them on probation and parole with these very, very stringent requirements. But we can put them in what prison abolitionist Mariame Kaba calls the somewhere else, that is away from you and your family and your community, where you don't have to think about them.
Even if that means we're going to trap you in your house, right?
Yes.
And I think, that's, it's important for people to sort of understand how corporations can often play on our language, on our sort of sentiments in various different ways, right? Like everybody wants to feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Like you and I want to feel safe in our communities, right? But the question is like, what is the source of safety, right? And they, I think in large part, try to play it themselves, right, as the source of safety. And even when they are, sort of pacifying in some ways to advocacy and saying like, oh, we get it, like incarceration's bad now. So let us be the next solution, right? The next type of safety. So let's unpack the role of the private sector a bit more in that. Are they really recognizing the shift in the tide that's kept them sailing all these years? And if so, how are they preparing for decarceration in a way that keeps their businesses afloat?
Yes. I mean, like all corporations that manage to survive, you shift with what the consumer tide looks like. So for instance, we know there's a growing recognition that there are a huge number and percentage of people with mental illnesses in jails and in prisons, that many people are not getting mental health treatment. Well, I would venture to say almost nobody is getting mental health treatment. So what we see is a rise of for-profit treatment centers that can incarcerate people. And their goal is not necessarily to get people to the point where they don't need psychiatric treatment, where they don't need to be supervised, they don't need to be locked away. They can rejoin their families and their communities and, live their lives without being a danger to anyone else or being endangered because of their mental health issues. But instead, the goal is to just keep warehousing them and keeping them under some sort of supervision and collecting that money. So it's a very good way of just turning that language. I mean, any person who studies business and marketing says, oh yeah, what is the current concern of people? The concern is X. How do we capitalize on this? We see this with GEO Group moving into halfway houses. We see this with privatized probation. We see this again and again and again, is that they expand. And if jails and prisons continue and they can continue to cash in on that, great. They now just have another way to make money off people's bodies and freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Geo Group, right? Geo Group, the largest private prison corporation, and now increasingly the largest community correctional corporation. And what they have, their like Geo Care, quote unquote, segment of their business, right? Which they describe as quote unquote a continuum of care, right? Essentially, we will keep you in the system for as long as we possibly can and be in charge of your correctional supervision, whether that's behind the gates, right, or in the community. So we put community corrections at the end of our curriculum here at Worth Rises because we felt that it best represented the future direction of our carceral system, the direction that it's moving in. And we think people really need to stay vigilant so that we don't dismantle one system to build a mirror image in another place. Your book was inspirational in that thought process. What inspired you to write Prison by Another Name?
So my co-author, Maya Shenwar, and I actually started writing this book when Obama was still president, and we saw the shift, the bipartisan push towards decarceration, towards recognizing that mass incarceration was racist. It upheld so many systemic injustices. And what we saw were that the popularly proposed reforms were things that looked remarkably like prison. They didn't decrease the amount of punishment that people were under, but it changed the way that prisons looked and ways that people were surveyed and confined and monitored and punished. And what we wanted to do was make sure that people who were working around criminal justice reforms or advocacy were aware of this, so that way we didn't end up building systems and fighting to build systems that we would then have to work another 10, 20, 30, 40 years to tear down later. So instead of having 2.2 million people in jails and prisons, we would have however many numbers of people in jails and prisons, plus 2.2 million people on these other alternatives that had been proposed and embraced.
So in closing, Vicki, what warning would you offer to criminal justice advocates in the practice and pursuit of prison and police abolition as they continue to fight?
I think we need to ask ourselves, whenever a reform is proposed, who is proposing it? I mean, if it is the Koch brothers, or if it is the Geo Group or Core Civic, or somebody who has been constantly tough on crime, we need to say, well, who's proposing this? And will it actually make our community safer, or will it simply shuffle people from a physical jail, prison, immigrant detention center, something else, into another type of confinement? Will this allow people to survive and thrive outside in the world, or will it turn their world into a jail cell or a prison cell?
Thank you so much, Vicki. To keep up with Victoria's work, please visit victorialaw.net. If you haven't yet, now's the time to drop your questions into the chat on YouTube and Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. But before we jump into Q&A, here are some of my takeaways from this week's discussion about community correction. We hear a lot about alternatives to incarceration, but these are often instead alternative forms of incarceration. Using a growing list of technologies, we are quickly turning our communities into cages. We are subjecting more and more people to surveillance, to the surveillance state, and putting more and more people under its control. Rather than decarcerating our prisons and jails, many of the reforms circulating are in fact widening the net or increasing the reach of our carceral system, as we've heard. And it's not always just surveillance that people are subjected to. In fact, one aspect that we didn't get to cover today is labor, or better yet, slavery. There are so many so-called diversion programs that use incarceration as a way to exploit people. There are unpaid work diversion programs that require people to work without pay while holding a jail or prison sentence over someone's head. These programs claim to teach work ethic. Again, a claim made back on slave plantations. And the companies that are involved in these types of programs include Walmart and Exxon, major corporations that we're familiar with. They have relationships with essentially mediators who help prosecutors divert people, help judges divert people into these programs. And in fact, the courts get a fee. And it's not just these type of unpaid work labor camps. There's also drug rehabs that take advantage of people who are struggling with substance abuse, and look for people to come into their programs and look for state compensation, or in fact, people who have to pay for their own drug programs. And if they can't, that too will make its way back into the carceral system. And we have corporations that actually go and find ways to get people charged. Corrective Solutions is a company that helps prosecutors find people who may have issued a bad check or things of that sort, and essentially threaten them. They send them documents and tell them to join their program, or they may be charged. In fact, very rarely are they ever charged, and were those ever disclosed to prosecutors. So there's tons of corporations beyond just those that we talked about in electronic monitoring, or that are doing halfway houses, or some of these other things that in fact are actually taking advantage of people who are not incarcerated at all, but who have a sentence somehow, some way hanging over their head. And so the bottom line is that we can't have those who are helping to drive incarceration through the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, like private prison corporations, or those who shamelessly fed off of it through those years at the table as we design the world that we want without prisons or jails, or the road to it. With that, now let's bring back all of our guests to answer some of your questions. So we have filled today's program with a lot of content. So we will take just a few questions. So I'm going to pose this first question. Actually, maybe Vinny and Victoria, you may both have a position on this. And so the first question comes in and asks, there was a mention of private probation corporations, but we didn't actually go into what they are. Could, Vinny, maybe you could take a stab. Victoria, if you have a bit to add, could you explain what a private probation corporation is?
Sure. So throughout the South, particularly the South, although other parts of the country as well, there are hundreds of thousands of people who get ordered onto probation. Instead of going to government-run probation like I ran, they go onto a private company. These companies will go to small municipalities and say, we can do probation for free. It won't cost you anything. And we're going to kick back money to you guys. So much so that when Harpersville, Tennessee lost a case, they had to close their entire municipal court down, and it blew a $300,000 hole in their budget. This private company was taking people, putting them on probation, and charging them enough to pay for their whole services plus profit, plus the whole municipal court, plus a $300,000 kickback to the county. So you and me, Bianca, go to court. We both have a bunch of parking tickets or speeding tickets that we haven't paid for. The judge is yelling at us and saying, we got to pay. My relatives have some cash. They give it to me. They pay, I'm done. I walk out of court, yours don't. And so the judge says, all right, well, I'm going to put you on probation for no other reason than to extract this money out of you. And while I'm extracting this $250, $500 out of you, the private probation company is going to bilk you for about that much, maybe even more in fees.
Vicky, is there anything you'd like to add on private probation?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, all of these quote unquote reforms or alternatives are also net wideners. I was just actually looking up, there was a case in somewhere in the South where a man stole a can of beer and was sentenced to a $200 fine and 1 year on privatized probation. He couldn't afford, he stole a can of beer. So let that sink in, you know, and he was sentenced to a $200 fine and 1 year on private probation. And he ended up going to jail because he was unable to afford the $200 and the fines for probation. So basically this is, if the county had to pay for that, they would not be paying for this man who stole one can of beer to be costing them that much money. But again, it is a way to widen the net without necessarily incurring any costs. And when he got out of jail, he was still responsible for the $200 plus all the fines and fees that had accumulated while he was in jail.
And one of his sources of income was selling his own blood to pay for probation. That man that stole that can of beer.
Wow. This next question is for you, James. The question is, what happens to the data collected by electronic monitoring from Chris Leach?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, there's no accountability for this data. In some jurisdictions, we'll have a stipulation that the data is the property of the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions might have a stipulation that it's supposed to be deleted after a certain period, but the default really is deregulation and no real accountability. So we don't know what happens to this data, just like we don't really know what's happening to the data that they're taking off our phones, right? We don't actually know where it all goes, who's using it, who's making money off of it, who's weaponizing it to find other ways to incriminate people. It's sort of the unknown of our era that we don't talk about because we love our cell phones so much we don't want to think about what they're doing to us, right?
You totally took that example out of my head. That's exactly what I was just thinking, James. And in fact, like during our telecom sector, right, we talked about a ton, I mean, not just our telecom sector, but our data and information sector. We talked about a ton of data that's being collected. In fact, right, the voice printing that's happening on prison phone calls now, and like how that data is going to be used. So we are running a little over time, so I'm going to jump to my last question. And I'm actually today going to ask a question of all the guests myself, because when we talk about the prison industry, we always close on community corrections. It's what I kind of refer to as the sector of our carceral future, right? The reality is that this is where we're going. And so as we close out on this last substantive episode of the curriculum before we move into talking about investors who prop up this system in our very last episode next week, I'd like each of you to share one thing that makes you nervous about the direction that criminal justice is moving in, and what keeps you hopeful that it'll shift to something that is truly liberatory and abolitionist in nature. And I'm going to ask y'all to keep it to about a minute each, just to help us wrap up here. And let's start with, we'll go in the order we want. Vinny.
This is it. I mean, I think that we need to not think that because we have good intent, good things will happen. So if our intent is to end mass incarceration, and we think that by simply pushing people onto community corrections, our job is done, we need to think again. There's a lot of evil stuff that can happen on community corrections. By the way, there's some good stuff that happens as well. Sometimes people hook up with a good PO, they help them find a job, and it's not all bad. But writ large, there's no evidence that this helps keep us safe or helps turn people's lives around. We really need to trust in our communities in ways that we've moved away from historically. And we cannot just move people and money from one part of the system to another and expect that to get us where we need to go.
Thank you, Vinny. James.
Okay, what makes me nervous is kind of what Vicky was talking about, but I call it carceral humanism, that these companies and government policymakers and mainstream Democrats become more and more sophisticated in the rhetoric of how they package punishment as something that's helpful and kind and is going to bring us forward and transform things. What makes me hopeful is pretty obvious. We now have an abolition movement in this country that we didn't have even 5 years ago. Miriam Kaba's book was number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people self-identifying as abolitionists who didn't know what it was 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So I think this is huge. This is because abolition is about revolution. I mean, I've been a socialist my entire life. I spent half of that life hardly being able to talk about it, because if you even speak the word, people are ready to throw you in front of an oncoming train. But now we can talk about these things. We can talk about transformative change, and we can talk about it in ways that build organization and help us build a movement that can do that. It's not inevitable, but it's an opportunity that we didn't have very recently, and it's really a cause for great hope, thanks to the uprising, and Lord bless George Floyd.
Thank you for that, James. Victoria.
So I'm going to echo my two co-panelists about the fears of falling for reforms that actually just enlarge our, the carceral system and enlarge the ways that we can punish people and keep them under some sort of surveillance and monitoring forever and ever and ever. But what gives me hope is, the fact that we've had this year of uprisings where there have been community mobilizations. We've had people rise up and say, defund the police and invest in communities, not just take away that money and have it go into a pot where nobody knows where it goes, but actually put the resources where it will help people, which is not in corporations' pockets, which is not in police budgets, but where do we need this so that way we can have communities where people survive and thrive. We see calls for decarceration, and we also see people embracing experiments in transformative justice and restorative justice and other means of addressing harm. Are they perfect? No, but as both Vinny and James pointed out, there's no metric that says probation, you have failed to actually keep people safe and you keep sending people back. Electronic monitoring, you have failed to keep people safe and send people back to prison, so we're going to stop you. So we should also say, we can't just say that one process failed in this one attempt and therefore we cannot keep trying this, but we need to say prison in all of its formations has not worked for us. It has not kept us safe. It has not helped people transform their lives or better their lives. So it's time for us to start embracing other forms.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Okay, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank all of our guests so much for joining us tonight. Vinny, James, Vicki, and thank you to all of you at home for joining us. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, for our last episode of Punishment and Profit about investors in the prison industry. For those who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask more questions or share your reflections, join us as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me, Bianca Tylik, to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about or support our work at Worth Rises, please check us out at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tylik. Good night.